Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeff Lurie, president of the Bethlehem Historical Association, and on behalf of the association, I'd like to warmly welcome you to our March Speaker Series. We're so glad you could join us tonight. It's always a pleasure to see such a strong turnout, and it's a reminder of just how much interest there is in the rich history that surrounds us here in Bethlehem and beyond. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few quick updates from the association. We recently opened a new Revolutionary War exhibit at the museum, and we're really excited about it. It brings to life a pivotal moment in our nation's history in a way that is both engaging and meaningful. It's just one of a few exciting plans we have for America's 250th. Thanks, Ralph. Whether you've visited us many times or have yet to stop by, there's always something new to discover. As a reminder, the museum is open on Sundays from 2 o'clock p.m. to 4 o'clock p.m., and we would truly love to see you there. It's a great way to spend an afternoon connecting with local history. As a fully volunteer-run organization, everything we do is made possible by people who care deeply about preserving and sharing our history. We are always looking for new volunteers, and there are many ways to get involved, whether it's helping at events, working with collections, assisting with programs, or sharing your own skills and interests. If something sparks your interest or curiosity, we'd be delighted to talk with you. I'd also like to extend our sincere thanks to the Bethlehem Public Library for hosting this wonderful speaker series. This partnership allows us to bring programs like tonight's to the community, and we're truly grateful for their continued support. If you're not already a member of the Bethlehem Historical Association, we encourage you to consider joining. Membership is a meaningful way to support our work and help ensure that we can continue offering programs, maintaining our collections, and preserving local history for future generations. There are membership envelopes available on your way out this evening, and you can also visit our website to learn more about upcoming events and everything happening at the association, like our upcoming annual tea in April. Now for tonight's program. This evening we'll be exploring a fascinating and deeply human side of the American Revolution. While we often think of the Revolution in terms of battles and politics, tonight's program invites us to look more closely at the personal experiences of those who lived through it. Through the story of one soldier, James Selkirk, we gain a unique window into the relationships and bonds that formed during wartime, connections that for many became a kind of family in the midst of uncertainty, hardship, and change. It's a powerful reminder that history is not always about events, but about people, their lives, their struggles, and their sense of belonging. Our speaker this evening, Robb Haberman, is a historian of early America who specializes in the American Revolution. He has taught at several distinguished institutions and brings both depth and clarity to his works. His research on James Selkirk sheds light on a perspective of the Revolution that is often overlooked, and we're fortunate to have him here to share that with us tonight. Following the presentation, we'll have time for a few brief questions, so I encourage you to think about what resonates with you as you listen. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Robb Haberman.
Everyone can hear me okay? Coming through? Excellent. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you also, Susan and Bill. And thanks to the Bethlehem Historical Association for inviting me back to be part of the Speaker Series program. And also thank you to the Bethlehem Public Library for hosting the event. Now, when I spoke here 2 years ago, I discussed James Selkirk's military service as well as the memoir that he wrote documenting his Revolutionary War experiences. This evening, I'm going to focus on how Selkirk maintained close connections with officers and enlisted men who served alongside him, and how this military community helped survive the many hardships that he encountered in the Continental Army. Before delving into Selkirk's wartime community, okay, good. Let's first take a look at an overview of his life. Selkirk was born in the fall of 1757 in the Scottish Lowlands, and as a young man, he immigrated to the province of New York. Soon after fighting broke out in Lexington and Concord, he joined the Lansingburgh Association in May 1775. So the Lansingburgh Association was basically a group of patriotic New Yorkers who promised to follow the guidelines and laws that were passed by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia and the Provincial Congress in New York. The association started in New York City, but then spread throughout the rest of the province. And Selkirk was one of 50 signers to the association when it was signed in Lansingburgh, where, as you probably know, is modern-day Troy, New York. So a year later, Selkirk joins the Continental Army, and he serves as a professional soldier for 7 years and 2 months. Following his discharge in June 1783, he settled in Bethlehem, where he married Elizabeth Henry, and he raised a family and earned his livelihood through farming and tailoring. In his twilight years, Selkirk wrote an account of his wartime experiences and included with it a general history of the American Revolution. The memoir provides a faithful record of the drudgery and dangers that he and his fellow soldiers faced. The memoir recounts how Selkirk marched nearly 2,000 miles and fought in several engagements at Saratoga, Rhode Island, Connecticut Farms, and Yorktown. The memoir also describes how Selkirk survived a bout of dysentery and ague, and these illnesses kept him hospitalized for several months. While working on his memoir, Selkirk successfully applied for a pension from the federal government. In March 1818, Congress passed legislation to provide support for the surviving Revolutionary War veterans. Selkirk's extended service in the Continental Army and his previous rank as a sergeant entitled him to an annual payment of $96. Now, Selkirk wanted the public to recognize the service and sacrifice that he and his fellow veterans had endured. He therefore decided to publish his wartime memoir, and he contracted with a local printer for this purpose. Unfortunately, Selkirk died in December 1820, and the work never appeared in print, as his death ended the project. Now, Revolutionary War memoirs are extremely rare, and most surviving accounts are written from the perspective of officers and senior commanders. So Selkirk's memoir is an invaluable resource for learning about the lives of Continental troops because it describes the conflict from the perspective of a common soldier. And it is our good fortune that Selkirk's descendants have kept his manuscript memoir for over 200 years and have preserved it for posterity. So let's now turn to the communities that Selkirk belonged to while serving in the Continental Army. And notice how I say communities plural rather than community singular. Specifically, Selkirk belonged to 3 communities that reflected his wartime service in different units of the Continental Army. And these are shown here on the chart. When he initially enlisted in the spring of 1776, Selkirk joined the community of John Nicholson's New York Regiment. This is the blue block shown at the top of the chart. Selkirk only served in Nicholson's unit for 8 months. So his memoir does not contain much information about his relationship with soldiers in this regiment. When Nicholson's regiment disbanded in late December 1776, James Selkirk then transferred into James Livingston's battalion. This is the red block in the middle. This unit was formed during the American invasion of Quebec, and it initially consisted of French Canadians and Americans who had moved to Canada. So for this reason, it was commonly referred to as the 1st Canadian Regiment. Now, Selkirk was a New Yorker, and you might be wondering how he came to join a unit of Canadian soldiers. The Canadian contingent in Livingston's battalion was actually too few in number to fill out the entire unit. So the battalion officers had to recruit the remaining soldiers from New York and other northern states. Selkirk served in this unit from January 1777 until it disbanded in December 1780. Selkirk then joined his 3rd unit, the 2nd New York Regiment, commanded by Colonel Philip Van Cortlandt. This is the yellow block. Selkirk belonged to this unit for 2.5 years, ending his affiliation in June 1783 when he was discharged from the Continental Army. Within each of the 3 regiments, Selkirk belonged to a community that provided him with friendship, protection from the enemy, and basic needs required for his survival. However, the situation is more complicated because there was overlap and continuity between these communities. So other soldiers followed the same pattern of service as Selkirk and were thereby serving beside him throughout the war. That is to say, like Selkirk, several other men enlisted first with Nicholson's regiment, then transferred into James Livingston's battalion, and then ended their wartime service with the 2nd New York Regiment. As a result, these movements created stronger bonds of camaraderie and trust that developed between Selkirk and his fellow soldiers because many of them had served together over an extended period in the same units. I first became interested in examining military community and its impact on Selkirk after reading 2 passages from his memoir that I found noteworthy. The first passage tells of the disbanding of Livingston's battalion as the men gathered for a final muster at Kings Ferry, New York. For Selkirk, the event proved to be a sad parting. He described it as such. We that had been for years together and shared together all the hardships of a soldier's life, cold, hunger, and nakedness, long and fatiguing marches, exposure to death many times in battles, with every other privation, who had by our very sufferings become united together as the children of one family, must now be separated, not knowing if we should see one another anymore. The same sentiments and phrases appear in Selkirk's description of the final muster for the 2nd New York Regiment. This event occurred at the New Windsor encampment in June 1783, and Selkirk describes it as follows. We were now to take our final farewell of one another. We that had been so long together and suffered so much together from cold, hunger, and nakedness, which were more or less our continual attendants for many years, must at last be separated, without indulging the hope of seeing one another any more. The regiment was my home, and the company, the family I belonged to. We were united together as the children of one common parent. And I find it intriguing that Selkirk uses kinship metaphors in both passages to describe the connections that he had with his fellow soldiers. He mentions that they were as close as siblings, and he explicitly refers to the regiment as his home and the company as his family. And I find these descriptions very telling. Selkirk clearly developed close bonds with the men who shared his daily routines and who ate, slept, worked, and fought side by side with him. And this also reminds me of the St. Crispin's Day speech from Shakespeare's Henry V, which the English king gives a rallying speech to his soldiers before going into battle. He uses the phrase band of brothers to refer to the close camaraderie formed by the troops who had experienced combat together. I think this same idea, this band of brothers, applies to Selkirk and the men in the regiment that he served with. Now bear in mind that Selkirk would have attached greater significance to these Army friendships because he had been living for 2 years without the benefit of family connections. While Selkirk resided in New York in 1774 and 1775, his family remained in Scotland. And not having his mother and siblings around to provide material comfort and emotional support probably made him more reliant on the friendships that he made in the Army. Moreover, there was actual overlap between friends and family in Continental Army regiments. It was common for male relatives, fathers, sons, brothers, uncles, nephews, cousins, to join the Army together and serve in the same regiment. So for instance, Colonel James Livingston arranged for his 2 brothers to hold high-ranking posts under his command. And James Livingston, as we know, is the commander of Selkirk's battalion. So here we see, this is a muster roll dated from December 1777 that shows James's older brother, Richard Livingston, who served directly below him as the battalion's lieutenant colonel. And we also see that James's younger brother, Abraham Livingston, served as a captain and led a company in the same battalion. Serving alongside male relatives was a common practice in the lower ranks as well. This was the case for the Stoner family, who lived in the Mohawk Valley. Henry Stoner, the father, served as a private in James Livingston's battalion. His two sons, Nicholas and John, also served in the unit as musicians. Nicholas was a fifer, and John was a drummer. So for the Stoners and the Livingstons, military service was indeed a family affair. Selkirk's comments on the disbanding of the two regiments further reveal that wartime adversity had strengthened the bond among his fellow soldiers. And for the rest of this evening, I'll discuss how Selkirk developed a strong sense of camaraderie because he relied on these men for his very survival. Now, when I say survival, I'm not referring to soldiers defending one another on the battlefield or in combat situations. Obviously, when engaging with the enemy, Selkirk would need to know that he could trust the men standing beside him to maintain formation and to obey orders so that his flanks and his rear position was well protected. However, for this evening, I want to focus on the non-combatant situations, such as when Selkirk was trudging on long and fatiguing marches, and when he was suffering from cold, hunger, and nakedness while on garrison duty or encamped in winter quarters. During these periods, Selkirk survived the travails of hard campaigning due to the cooperation and collective efforts of the officers and enlisted men who were at his side. The importance of close camaraderie becomes apparent to Selkirk at the onset of his military service. In April 1776, he went northward to join Nicholson's regiment at Fort Ticonderoga. Selkirk's voyage on Lake George was a miserable slog. He was beset by fatigue, hunger, and loneliness, and he also had to take his turn manning the oars in the vessel as they rowed from Fort George in the south to Fort Ticonderoga. His traveling companions were soldiers from different regiments, and they ignored Selkirk and did nothing to ease his discomfort. Whereas these men had plenty of food, Selkirk had arrived late and had received no rations. He was demoralized that no one would share their food or help him out, even though he was clearly suffering. The poor treatment led him to question the wisdom of choosing military service over civilian life. He wrote, "I thought from this circumstance they could not avoid taking any notice of me and would naturally inquire if I had nothing to eat, and on answering the negative, they would hospitably supply my wants. But I found they were more intent upon their own concerns than mine. I looked wishfully on while they were cooking and eating, still expecting that someone who had a feeling for his fellow creature would inquire into my case. But there was none who cared for me. I was young and bashful and would rather suffer than let my wants be known. If this is the way that soldiers was used, my first 2 days and 2 nights campaign was long enough for me." Despite this harsh reception to Army life, Selkirk remained in Continental service. This episode, however, helped him appreciate the importance of having messmates and squad members who would share in his suffering and who would also do their utmost to help each member of the group. The need for mutual assistance and cooperation was important in all units of the Continental Army, but it was especially true for James Livingston's battalion. As one of the 2 Continental regiments formed in Canada, Livingston's battalion faced a host of challenges that diminished its cohesion, morale, and efficiency. Foremost among these problems was the fact that the unit was not affiliated with a home state. Most other regiments in the Continental Army were raised in a particular state, like New York or New Jersey. The colonels commanding these regiments could rely on a measure of support from their state governor and legislature to equip their troops with food, arms, and supplies, and to help provide reinforcements to replenish the ranks. But since Livingston's battalion was raised in Canada, it lacked this support network, and Colonel Livingston had to constantly seek assistance from Congress and the Continental Army's High Command to make up the shortfall. In fact, James Livingston actually wrote to the governor of New York requesting that his regiment be incorporated into the New York line, specifically so it could have a supply base. But this request was denied. So despite Colonel Livingston's best efforts, the battalion was consistently undersupplied, and the men had to rely on their own ingenuity and each other to make sure that they had enough food, clothing, and equipment to survive. So here on the screen, we have one example of how the shortages were for Selkirk and his fellow soldiers. In June 1779, Livingston's battalion was stationed in Rhode Island, where it was keeping an eye on British troops who were occupying Newport. A report issued that same month called for 142 pairs of shoes to be supplied to Livingston's battalion. This report thereby indicated that nearly all of the non-commissioned officers, privates, and musicians who numbered to 146 men, that all of these men in the battalion lacked adequate footwear. The supply problem even led to near mutiny among Livingston's men when they marched to their winter quarters in Jockey Hollow, located in Morristown, New Jersey. When Selkirk and his comrades reached Jockey Hollow, they faced an even more extreme crisis. The winter of 1779-1780 proved extraordinary for its massive snowfall, accumulation, frigid temperatures, and freezing of coastal waterways. Writing from Morristown, George Washington observed, "The oldest people now living in this country do not remember so hard a winter as the one that we are now emerging from. In a word, the severity of the frost exceeded anything of the kind that had ever been experienced in this climate before." Selkirk noted the freezing weather too, claiming, "We suffered more this winter with cold, hunger, and nakedness than ever we experienced before." To make matters worse, upon arriving at their winter encampment, Selkirk and his comrades found that the heavy snowfall prevented them from building their log huts. Now, all of the other Continental soldiers stationed at Morristown, they had log huts for their accommodations. But Selkirk and his colleagues in Livingston's battalion, they had to spend several weeks residing in canvas tents during the coldest winter in living memory. Selkirk wrote, "We were almost perished in the tents. We were very poorly clothed and but few old blankets to cover us." Moreover, extreme hunger intensified the soldiers' misery. Rations were issued infrequently, so the soldiers had to seek sustenance wherever they could find it. Selkirk told of one soldier who became sick from eating candles because he was so hungry. And Selkirk and his messmates had to dig up from under the snow the feet of cattle that had been killed in the fall, and then boil these cattle's feet into a broth, even though this cattle meat, this was half rotten. In the face of starvation, Selkirk admitted, "We were glad to eat them to satisfy our craving appetites." So Selkirk prepared, shared, and ate his rations with other members of his mess. In the Continental Army, the mess was a squad of 4 to 8 men who made their meals together and they used cooking utensils that they shared. Selkirk noted the centrality of the mess for his survival. He remarked that in his mess, each one did what he could to make the other happy. Selkirk also noted that each member of his mess followed a set of governing principles, asserting the laws of our mess must be rigidly attended to. So, what I'm going to show you on the screen, these are not formal rules per se, but more general practices followed by Selkirk and his messmates. First, it was understood that the mess was to use economy and frugality at all times in regards to our provisions. Selkirk's messmates put this principle into practice by not eating all their food meant for a designated number of meals. Instead, they would lay aside part of their food for later occasions when no rations were issued. By this economy, Selkirk noted, we got a stock in hand, and then we never were so hungry as when we were scanted. Selkirk's comrades also supplemented their food stock. During the warmer months, they would gather vegetables and catch fish in nearby rivers and lakes. Now, this type of activity proved impossible at Morristown because of the freezing weather. But nonetheless, Selkirk insisted that we were always industrious in procuring something to add to our provisions at Morristown. And one way he and his messmates were able to do this is that they would trade with local farmers. Specifically, Selkirk mentioned that he traded for raw corn from civilians living nearby the camp. And he observed that by engaging in such business, we could make an exchange to great advantage with the country people. According to Selkirk, by following these practices in the mess, he and his soldiers, his fellow soldiers, were able to ward off starvation at Morristown. When Livingston's battalion was disbanded in December 1780, Selkirk and the other New Yorkers who had been serving in this unit transferred into the 2nd New York Regiment. After participating in the siege at Yorktown, the 2nd New York marched northward to its winter quarters at Pompton, New Jersey. Selkirk performed important tailoring duties while stationed at Pompton. In early 1782, each enlisted man in the 2nd New York was issued a new set of clothes that were taken from captured British supplies. Selkirk complained that up to this point, the men in his regiment presented a hodgepodge and shabby appearance, so it was a happy occasion for the men to be issued new uniforms. In addition to receiving new clothing that had been taken from enemy stores, the 2nd New York was also furnished with linen overalls. Before these overalls could be distributed to the troops, however, they first had to be cut from cloth and then reassembled according to specification. Selkirk, who had been apprenticed as a tailor, was tasked with the important job of cutting out patterns for the overalls. The regimental orderly book, shown here, recorded his work as a tailor. It reads, Sergeant Selkirk of Captain Pell's company will cut out under the direction of Mr. Connolly all the overalls that are to be made, and there is not to be the least addition or alteration of any kind made in the cut or fashion of the patterns delivered to the companies by any of the company tailors. Although this was supposed to be a group project, Selkirk ended up doing much of the work alone. As he explained in his memoir, I was appointed in regimental orders to superintend a piece of mechanical business with 3 or 4 others to assistance. But these others did not please the paymaster, who had the charge of the whole, and dismissed them in 2 days' time, and the whole work devolved on me, which took me about 6 weeks to accomplish. When this was done, I, with 3 or 4 more, obtained a pass to go into the country. This passage shows that Selkirk's commanding officers rewarded his tailoring work with a furlough, that is, a temporary leave from military duties. And Selkirk certainly relished the opportunity to be free of the labor, discipline, and monotony of camp life. With a few other soldiers, Selkirk left Pompton and traveled to a nearby private house looking for food and drink. That night, he became violently ill and feared for his life. Selkirk believed, and he wrote this in his memoir, that he was stricken with pleurisy and dysentery. His body became so swollen that he could not lie down. The other men went back to camp seeking help while he remained at the house. The following day, Selkirk's comrades returned with a horse. They were able to sit him up on the animal and carefully lead him back to the army camp. However, the regimental surgeons could not offer any assistance, and they basically left him to die. And that might not necessarily be a bad thing, because Selkirk writes that the regimental surgeons, their proposed treatment was bleeding. They were going to take a pint or 2 of his blood, but they said, in your conditions, it's too late, bleeding's no good, you're on your own. So Selkirk now was left in the care of the men in his company. His fellow soldiers, including his commander, Captain Samuel Pell, took turns sitting with him, propping him up on a bed, and rubbing his swollen abdomen. Selkirk noted that Captain Pell was especially kind to him and even gave Selkirk his own flannel waistcoat to wear for warmth. Eventually, another soldier suggested a home remedy that might cure Selkirk of his illness. On screen, we see the recipe and instructions, and Selkirk claimed that this treatment eased his swelling and pain, and that he gradually recovered and was able to walk on his own. So to summarize, Selkirk survived the travails of Morristown and Pompton due to the collective efforts of the officers and enlisted men who served alongside him. Focusing on these experiences highlights how Continental troops formed close communities and relied on cooperation and mutual aid to combat illness, hunger, and inclement weather. The soldiers' very survival depended on this mutual assistance, as the formal channels of supply and support proved inadequate to provide the necessary clothing, foodstuffs, lodging, and medical treatment needed for survival. So as we saw with the regimental surgeons and also the quartermaster's department, these units were unable to provide the necessary services to Selkirk and his fellow soldiers. This strong sense of unit solidarity helped the men to overcome shared adversities. When Selkirk left the Army in June 1783, he eloquently summarized the significance of these close-knit communities in wartime, observing, "The regiment was my home, and the company, the family I belonged to. We were united together as the children of one common parent." Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions, if anybody has any. Okay.
Please, Ralph.
Could you talk for a few moments about why the different regiments disbanded?
Sure. So I'm going to go back to this chart here. John Nicholson's regiment was actually, this was a unit made up of New Yorkers that was formed also during the invasion of Quebec. And it was formed from men from other regiments that were disbanding but wanted to continue their service in the Canadian invasion. However, Nicholson's regiment, you can see, only lasted a short while. The men who signed on only had to serve for 1 year. And at the end of that year, December 1776, that unit was disbanded. Now, Selkirk, when he joins James Livingston's battalion, okay, he signs up for the duration of the war. And there's actually a little bit of confusion about this, because he mentions in the memoir that he only meant to serve for a limited time, for 3 years. But he ended up serving. It was written down, the officer wrote him down for service for the entirety of the conflict. And this is shown in the muster rolls next to his name. It'll say James Selkirk, it'll say sergeant, and then it says duration, meaning meaning that he's serving for the entirety of the war. So Selkirk joins Livingston's battalion because he has a friend who is an officer in this unit. And his friend says, you know, if you come and join, I'm the unit's quartermaster, you can serve as my quartermaster sergeant. Okay, so Selkirk does this. However, this officer was soon promoted and transferred to an artillery unit. So Selkirk loses this, what I believe would be more of a cushier duty as quartermaster sergeant. He's still holding the rank of sergeant, but no longer doing quartermaster duties. So he serves in Livingston's battalion until the end of 1781. And by the end of 1781, as I had mentioned, Livingston's battalion was the men were truly suffering. They weren't getting the necessary uniforms, rations that were due to them. They also weren't getting paid either. In fact, right before Livingston's battalion disbands, the regimental paymaster was sent, I believe, to Albany to collect the wages due to the troops for 3 months' time. But when he returns to camp, his trunk is stolen from his tent. And the trunk, of course, contained the wages for the soldiers. Selkirk complains to his officers. James Livingston, the colonel, writes to George Washington. And George Washington says, oh, you need to write to Congress about this. Let them resolve this. And basically, the situation is never resolved. The soldiers never receive their the payment that is due to them. So Livingston's battalion was undergoing all of these hardships, and as a result, you have a lot of soldiers deserting their posts. Selkirk remains loyal. He stays as a member of Livingston's battalion, but many comrades do desert. And by late 1780, right when they disband, Livingston's battalion numbers roughly 120 men, okay? The other Canadian regiment in the Continental Army numbers 400. Okay, so that gives you an idea of how bad the situation was in Livingston's battalion, that so many men would be deserting. And the regiment at this time was so small that it's basically written off. So this is the reason why Livingston's battalion is disbanded at the end of 1780. And then the 2nd New York Regiment under Philip Van Cortlandt. This unit is disbanded permanently in June 1783. Okay, the war doesn't end until November 1783, but basically by mid-1782, there was a rough agreement between the British and the Continental Army that they were not going to seek each other out in major engagements. There was still some fighting that was taking place in the last years of the war, but overall it was understood by Washington and the High Command that there wasn't going to be any more major fighting taking place. So in the meantime, you have the Continental Army in New Windsor encampment. These soldiers have to be fed, they have to be paid, they have to be housed, etc. And Washington and Congress are basically, they don't have the funds to do this. So what happens, even though, again, the war doesn't end formally until November 1783, that during the summer of that year, you have many regiments are put on permanent furlough, including the 2nd New York Regiment.
So it sounds like that in each case, the regiment was under-resourced.
Yeah.
It was painful for the soldiers, so they moved on to what appeared to be a better resourced regiment.
Yes, and this was done somewhat voluntarily, although with James Selkirk, because he had signed up for the duration of the war, he had to go into, he and the other New Yorkers from Livingston's battalion were sent into the New York Regiment. But yes, they were certainly under-resourced. And it's amazing to me, just from reading this, because this is a constant complaint throughout the memoir for James Selkirk, how hungry he and the other men are, how on a regular basis they're not receiving their wages. He describes their uniforms for much of their wartime service in tatters. He says, he writes while they're marching through Kinderhook, he said that he was embarrassed for the men in his company because they looked like scarecrows. None of them had, a similar uniform to one another, matching clothes. And he said that they were looked down upon by the civilians as well. So again, this took a toll on unit cohesion and morale, particularly with James Livingston's battalion. It is somewhat understandable why you would have such high rates of desertion.
Where exactly did he settle down after the war? Because I know there's Selkirk Shores on Lake Ontario, there's Selkirk everywhere.
So he was, what I've read is he was in Rensselaer, Van Rensselaer's Manor, which is quite a large estate. And then in the early 1800s, he is noted as being in Bethlehem. That is, he shows up the family shows up in the census records in Bethlehem. And I'm going to have to defer. Susan, is there anything you can add to this regarding?
Quite sure how to summarize. They end up in basically the hamlet of Selkirk today in what was known as Cedar Hill because of their connection to the Henry family and the Nichols Sill estate. So they were definitely in Bethlehem. Bethlehem became a town in 1793, and so after they were definitely in Bethlehem. Selkirk Shores, I don't think is our Selkirk family. I think it's a different branch of the Selkirks. So, I don't know if that helps.
Thank you, Susan.
Any other questions?
Was he ever wounded?
He wasn't wounded in battle, although he did have a very close call. At the battles of Saratoga in the fall of 1777, Saratoga was a time there was a British invasion from Canada, a British army along with Hessian auxiliaries and Native American allies invaded the northern colonies. And they were stopped by an army under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold at Saratoga, which was a victory for the Americans. And it was so important that this is what brought France onto the side of the Patriots. But Selkirk, in the final days of the battle, the American army has surrounded General Burgoyne's, the British commander's, camp. They're besieging the camp. And Selkirk and the men in his squad are in a redoubt made of logs, and they're keeping an eye on the British, make sure they can't escape, etc. And what happens is a British cannonball from the camp is fired, and it comes through the redoubt. It comes through the logs, and the soldier sitting on the left of Selkirk is decapitated. And Selkirk writes about this. He says that part of the man's skull and brains and such, he said, were all over his jacket and in his hat. And Selkirk writes, "At first, I thought I was mortally wounded." He didn't realize it was his comrade. And at that point, he does suffer from that. Some bone fragments do go into his neck. He says, though, that he considered, although this was, I'm sure, a serious wound, he says, "I was fortunate that this was my only injury." And Selkirk, at the same time, twice in the beginning of the conflict, right after he joins John Nicholson's regiment, he becomes severely ill and spends several months in a hospital at Johnson Hall. And then at the end of the war, as I mentioned, when he's at Pompton, he becomes sick with what he describes dysentery and pleurisy. And there he is sick for a few months. Please.
The soldiers have to swap with the farmers for their goods. What do they have?
Yeah, this is Selkirk doesn't specify what normally he used to barter or to purchase because with local civilians, because the soldiers weren't getting their wages. From what I've read from other accounts, it was common for soldiers also to take the buttons from their coats, which were pewter, so a combination of silver and tin, and use those in exchange, or they might use their knee buckles or shoe buckles as well, had some value. Please.
I noticed from the timeline that in less than a year from landing in the colonies, he joined Lansingburg, and then in less than 2 years, he joined the Continental Army.
Yes.
Did he come to the colonies expressly to join the Army? What pulled him?
Yeah, my understanding is that he came from the lowlands of Scotland. His father had died when he was an infant, and he was raised by his uncle, who was apparently somewhat well off. And this is, I believe, when Selkirk was apprenticed as a tailor under his uncle's direction. And also, his uncle saw that he learned to read and write as well. And this uncle was also taking care of Selkirk's mother and siblings as well. So my understanding is that he came to the province of New York because it was an opportunity for improving his situation, finding better job opportunities. And he came, now there is, in an earlier history of the Selkirk family, there is claims that when he came over on the Gale to New York, that there were members of the Henry family aboard the ship, and possibly his wife, who was much younger, Elizabeth Henry, was on that ship as well. I actually haven't found documents, corroborating this, but nonetheless, what I would say is that he mostly came to New York on his own, 16 years old. And he ends up residing in, I found records based on the memoir, that he does stay in Albany and other communities north of Albany, so like near Lansingburg as well. And I believe he's plying his trade as an itinerant laborer, where he is either working as a tailor, as a clerk, or maybe a farmhand, depending on seasonal work. And he mentions in the memoir that at this time, he is living at different times with friends or people who become his friends as well. So there's unfortunately not that much known about his time from in growing up in Scotland and then migrating to North America.
We have time for one last question.
Please, Ralph.
Wonderful talk, by the way, very engaging. I was wondering if you could update us on the status of the book.
Oh, okay, gladly. So the book is now in its final stages of production. It's coming out with Westholme Press in May, late May of this year. The maps are all completed. The text is all completed. Right now, the press is just working on the index. And the title, as you see, is James Selkirk's Revolutionary War, the Memoir of a Continental Sergeant, and again, available through Westholme Publishing.
Thank you. And Ralph,
So thank you
you
also.
weren't a plant. Thank you, Rob. And one last announcement is that one of our sister organizations, the Clarksville Historical Association, is having Radio City Rounders play for them on April 1st, which is open to the public at 7 o'clock. We hope to see you in April at our tea and back here for our next speaker. Thank you, Rob. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.